Good afternoon. My name is Askold Melnyczuk. Welcome to For the Record, another episode of a series of conversations with Ukrainian writers and intellectuals in a time of war. My guest today is Volodymyr Yermolenko. Volodymyr Yermolenko is a Ukrainian philosopher, writer, journalist, and the editor of Ukrainian History and Stories, as well as a senior lecturer at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. He's also the editor-in-chief of the essential website Ukraine World, which offers a comprehensive menu of news, in-depth analysis, and the podcast Explaining Ukraine, of which Volodymyr is the co-host. He has published important articles and essays in The Economist, Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera, and many other places. Welcome, Volodymyr.
Thank you so much, Askold. It's a great honor for me.
Well, first, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to have a chance to speak with you at last. Your website, Ukraine World, is full of so much fascinating material and provides so many possible avenues for conversation. You have articles and podcasts on what it's like for a mother and child to be negotiating their new lives as refugees, another one on the situation of prisoners of the Kremlin, as well as deep dives into the cultural history of Ukraine, underscoring its pull toward Europe and its differences from Russian culture. I'm hoping in the next 45 minutes or so we could cover, however briefly, three areas, all of which you're exceptionally fluent in: culture and its relation to society, the differences in how Ukraine is perceived within Europe, as well as the differences between European and US attitudes, and the role that disinformation and corruption play in these differences, as well as what you imagine might be the steps Ukraine might need to take in order to recover from the trauma of war. But first, I want to ask you an impossible question. How do we talk about war in the first place? In your conversation with Ezra Klein in the New York Times, you make an essential point, and I'm quoting you now. You can't say that the war experience is everywhere the same because it's different for a person who's on the front line. It's different for a person who is a refugee. It's different for a person who left his house or her house, but still has a place to come back to. I have several friends who are basically not sure if their houses are still there. End quote. And reading this, I was reminded of being in Kyiv in 2018 at the Arsenal Book Fair and having a conversation with the writer Oksana Zabushko, who was underscoring that the nation was at war, while I looked around at the exuberant, joyful life around me, all these sort of young people rushing to buy books, this excitement about intellectual life. And it was hard to reconcile my immediate reality with the larger picture. And I think of that partly because, again, I'm speaking to you from Boston, and the war is very, very far away from us. And the challenge seems to be now is to make the reality of that war somehow palpable to those for whom it is simply a story in the news. Any ideas?
How to make it palpable? I think the best way is to be curious about human stories and be interested in as many human stories as possible, and be as closer to the source as you can be. For us Ukrainians, it means travel a lot, and therefore we are trying to travel a lot. And of course, it's sometimes difficult because we have our commitments, family commitments, work commitments, but we try to go somewhere every week, either to places closer to the front line or to places where the war took place 5-6 months ago. There is lots of to be seen even around Kyiv. Kyiv is now, well, it's difficult to say it, of course, for people outside, but Kyiv is a safe place, relatively safe place. Of course, every day we hear air raid sirens, but there were missile attacks on Kyiv in February and March, but not now. It doesn't mean that they cannot happen later, but Kyiv is a vibrant city right now. Lots of people, lots of movement, many people from other parts of the country, of course, covered by the war. But as long as you go outside Kyiv to all these villages which surrounds it, you understand that, well, you see the traces of the war. You talk to people, you see their wounds, people who lost their relatives, right? The close people, and of course the destruction. There's nothing going on around with this destruction. So if you go to villages like Moshchun or Horinka or towns like Makariev or villages like Velika Dimerka or some others, you still see a lot of destruction. And destruction is just one thing. You need to talk to people. And these wounds, I mean, I will tell you one story. Recently, we went to Bucha. Everybody, I think, knows the word Bucha. And there is these car cemeteries, the collection of cars who were burned during the people trying to escape Bucha in February and March. And suddenly a man came to us and said that, look, I recognize the car of my friend and my neighbor. And he died in this car. He was burnt alive. And I will show you even the remnants of his bones. And we just look inside and we understand, yes, there can be something like this, and this is the only thing that remained of him. And he told us the story of this family who from Hostomel, a town of also near Kiev, who tried to escape, and they were just shelled by Russian soldiers, and the man was killed. But his wife and his daughters hopefully survived almost miraculously, but the younger daughter, I think 8 years old, lost her hand, and the hand needed to be amputated. And I even think that she's now in America with prosthesis and something like this. And it's just the man who was telling us the story just couldn't help, couldn't stop crying. And this is a big man, you know. So, and these stories are everywhere. You just need to talk to people, and this is it. I mean, the
Yeah.
war is not figures. The war is not only figures. The war is human stories primarily.
No, absolutely. The idea is that you are able to, being in Ukraine, to get to these sites and to see these things in person. What I'm thinking about is how to convey it to people around me here in Boston. And one of you say, that I agree with you that the importance of travel is the travel is essential, and the fact is that I'm hoping that it will be possible for more writers, intellectual speakers from Ukraine to come to the U.S. also, because your personal witness and testimony are of inestimable value. The story you just told is profound and intense, and your being an eyewitness to it carries a certain weight and gravity that telling it secondhand does not. I also understand that there are issues with visas and difficulties of getting out of the country right now, and that is perhaps a problem that needs to be rectified and addressed.
But people in the US or in Europe just can address journalists or those websites. As we have Ukraine World, we have a section stories.
Yes.
Just go to our website. We collect already several dozens of stories, and these are just personal stories of people whom we interviewed. And there are lots of other projects like us. There is, for example, our friends from the Public Interest Journalism Lab, Natalka Humenyuk and Lina Karyakina and others. They travel a lot across Ukraine. They're making videos. There are lots of things done by Hromadske, for example, independent media. Lots of stories. Just people need to be kind of to have this thirst for these human stories, and to understand that really, as I said to Ezra Klein, and I really stay on this point, that there is no common experience of the war. Every single experience is unique and in a way incommunicable. So you cannot really communicate it. You cannot really be that person who just another person we talked to in Bucha. Hopefully her family is okay, but she lost her family lost several houses which were in the same place, because there was her mother's house and then their house, and usually the houses of Ukrainians is not something you buy on a mortgage loan. You build through decades yourself with your hands, and these are the stories that you can be building your house for 30 years and then lost it in 30 seconds. And yeah, this is it.
Right. So maybe we can step away from the immediate moment and try to get a sort of a deeper understanding of how we got here. You've written and spoken very eloquently about the role of culture in Ukraine and the way it differs from Russian culture. In a really interesting essay on atypical post-colonialism, you write that while post-colonial nations colonized by Western European empires had to prove their identity was valid and their voices should be heard, Ukrainian post-colonialism was a struggle with a somewhat different challenge. It needed to prove that its identity existed at all, that it had not been invented by an external conspiracy. That's a fascinating premise to propose, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what created these very different sort of structures in post-colonial societies.
Right. So I think when we're thinking about Russian colonialism, we have to understand that it is in some aspects different from what Western societies were reflecting upon when we're thinking about colonialism. So I think if we read Edward Said today, and this is very important read to understand that there are many things that are similar and many things that are different. If you take maritime empires, when they colonize other people, the first thing they notice is the difference of others' identities, of their ethnicity, of their language, of their race, of their culture, of their traditions, etc. And therefore, the key, reflection, this colonialism reflection of these empires was to how you can use this difference for the imperial purposes. And the most tricky, the most obvious thing is to say that the difference is actually the hierarchical difference. So they are not only different, these colonized people, but they are lower than us and we are upper than them. So the difference is hierarchical. So the difference, the idea of difference is just a modus of domination. And in Russian colonialism, I would say that not the difference is the instrument of domination, but the idea of sameness, if I can use this word in English. I'm not sure if it
Absolutely.
exists.
Yes, it does.
The sameness is the instrument of domination and not the difference. With regard to Ukrainians, to Belarusians, etc. So the Russians are just coming and saying, you are the same as us. And this assimilation doctrine is basically the key instrument of colonization. So they're not stressing the difference, they're stressing the sameness. And any difference that Ukrainians were trying or Belarusians were trying to portray was considered by the Russians as deviations. And from here, you see all the story that, well, every Ukrainianness is a kind of a deviation. And you move to article, I think, by Vladislav Surkov, who is one of the ideologists of Putin. I think it was 1 year ago or something like that, when he said that Ukrainianness is a disease, is a deviation and psychological disease. And I think this is the most important thing. When maritime empires are talking to the colonized people, they're saying, look, there is a threshold you cannot really cross. So this racial difference will be always there. Russians are saying, no, come on, you can cross this difference, you can cross this threshold. But in order to cross this threshold, you should just forget about yourself. You should forget about your language, your culture, your traditions, etc. Therefore, this attack on culture was very important in the 19th century, 20th century, and is important right now. So this colonialism through assimilation, through this spread of the concept of the sameness, and I think we should just analyze it deeply to understand it deeper, and just understand that there is a kind of another type of colonialism, which acts not through otherness, alterization, but through this idea of the sameness. Therefore, the basic concepts of the Russian intellectual culture, like Всеединство by Vladimir Solovyov, they only seem to be kind of innocent concepts, but inside themselves, this всеединство, meaning the all unity
Yeah.
of everything. When you don't really stress the difference, you stress the sameness, and it appears to be very dangerous thing, because it appears to be an instrument of domination. And then they come, of course, to other nations in Central Europe and say, okay, you're the same as us, and you should erase all your culture. We should all become one Soviet people.
Well, it's so interesting. You actually have a wonderful phrase for this, and you write in that same article, an empire is a political project able to copy paste itself everywhere else in the world. I love that, the copy pasting itself. And at the same time as you're speaking, I can't help but be struck that what you're describing is not all that different from something that I experienced living through growing up within the United States. I mean, assimilation was the model that I first encountered when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s. We were all refugees and immigrants, children of refugees and immigrants, were supposed to assimilate into the American project. And that only began to break down, I think, as a result of the kind of different sort of the deviant thinking of the 60s, and its sort of a legacy as we began to enter into the sort of fondness for pluralism and multiculturalism, as it was labeled, which seemed to mean nothing other than a kind of honoring and recognition of difference and celebrating that difference. Somehow that, even in the United States, is being seriously challenged right now. And that sort of makes me wonder what sort of spirit is moving across the planet, because we're certainly seeing similar tendencies in kind of conservative right-wing movements in Europe, in India with Modi, the desire for a kind of unitary culture seems to have been revived, when I thought that we had kind of past that. Do you have any idea, any sort of thoughts about what might be encouraging this transformation of our attitudes?
Look, I think that this is a pendulum of history. This is normal because, well, this goes back to very old philosophical concepts. What is the primary? Is it unity or difference? And this goes back to Plato and his very sophisticated dialogues on dialectics that nobody understands. But Plato just understands that this is the core of things, because this is maybe the most important philosophical problem, where how we build a unity which is kind of accepts plurality, and how we build a plurality which is more or less solidary, right? And which does not is not fragmented, does not split apart. So I think that maybe in America you had quite probably similar processes, and but there is really this breakthrough. I think we can call it postmodern or whatever. In the 60s, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, all over the world. And then in Europe, you have this post-structuralism, which stresses the role of difference, but this difference is no longer hierarchical. So it's really fights against this concept of hierarchy. And maybe in some aspects we went too far, because if you are only cherish the difference, the otherness, then you're saying that, look, well, you are the other, you are another, you are not like me. I respect you, but I don't care about you, right? So and this is also a trap, because of course we need to develop a certain idea of unity among people. And I think right now Ukrainians are also struggling with this, maybe Orientalism or something like this, when we are just telling to the world, look, we are not others, we are the same as you, we have the same wish for freedom, we have the same idea of free societies, and we are struggling for this. we're not just an exotic country in which, you know, people are fighting each other because one is speaking Ukrainian, another speaks Russian. No, it's not like that. We're just like you, and we really cherish the same spirit which was cherishing, I mean, the founding fathers of the America, or the French Revolution, or something like this. So of course we kind of need to go into this way, how to be in the unity but cherish plurality, and how to be in plurality but at the same time have this spirit of solidarity. I love very much the phrase of my friend Vahtan Kibuladze, Ukrainian philosopher, who said that there is a difference between totalitarianism and democracy. Democracy is the society of solidary competitors. So there should be a fight, there should be a competition, but they kind of have this sense of solidarity. Totalitarianism is a society of the atomistic enemies. When he's saying about atomistic enemies, he means that as soon you remove this hierarchical structure, everything turns into the war of all against all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is the also the root of this maybe far right revisionism or revanchism, is that they are coming from people who are actually not feeling very well in this society, not able to talk with others and to understand each other. They are feeling that they are surrounded by enemies, and therefore they need to have this superstructure which would keep them together. I think this is one of the key reasons of Putinism in Russia, because as far as we see the Russian society, how they talk, how they respond to questions in the public opinion polls, what movies they watch, and how their soldiers behave in Ukraine, that's the most critical thing, is that it's obviously kind of a culture of violence, where violence is considered as an essential part of power. You only have power on others if you can exert violence on others. That is something very pervert but very present in this Russian culture, and I think this is kind of leads to Putinism in a very specific way.
Yeah, I mean, again, what you're describing certainly coincides with my sort of understanding of the tone and temper of the right wing here as well. And of course, it sounds like the kind of culture of violence that was an essential element of Nazism. It's interesting because you also note that the Soviet Union was the result of a victory for Westernizers, progressive, atheist, often materialist intellectuals and activists, and yet this very victory gave rise to the most anti-Western empire in Russian history. And that itself is, one of those puzzling paradoxes, that the idea of having absorbed certain aspects of the Enlightenment, and then having created this sort of distinction of the more than a distinction between church and state, but a destruction of the church and the domination of the state. It has a. I have a hard time seeing where it made that sort of transition. Was it simply a kind of a matter of the megalomaniacal and paranoid leaders at the top, or were there deeper roots that led to this turn against the West and again? One thinks of the way in which Russian culture revered French culture, the way in which the sort of at least the elites in Russia intermarried with Europeans. Right, there was that sense of that there would be more of a kind of closer communion, and you wonder how it is that, was it a matter of individuals, or was it something more deeply rooted in the culture that led to this sort of rise of the culture of violence and worship of that?
Look, I think it's very deep, and we should read Dostoevsky to understand it,
I've
because
read, yes.
not only his big novels, but one of the phrases in his writer's diary, when he says, okay, look, but the so-called Westernizers, when they come to Europe, they become even much more critics of Europe than the Slavophiles. And he, of course, had in mind people like Herzen or maybe some others. But this is a paradox of the Russian history, and it was described not by myself. It was also described by the Russian writers, like Dmitry Merezhkovsky was one of those I remember who pointed to this paradox, is that why the biggest tyranny comes in Russia with people who initially wants to bring Russia to Europe. And he, of course, meant Peter the First, because Peter the First, he also remarkable for his extreme cruelty. And Merezhkovsky wrote a novel about Pyotr and Alexei, about the murder of his son. And this was very important moment. Then, if we take, for example, the next century, Alexander the First, he was very much pro-European, even part of the maybe Masonic some societies. But then he got a victory over Napoleon, and that's it. And then it led to very anti-republican, anti-revolutionary regime of his, and then Nicholas the First. So the Bolsheviks, the paradox that I point out, that the Bolsheviks is a result of the big struggle of ideas in Russia in the 19th century between Slavophiles and the Westernizers. And this was the victory of the Westernizers because it comes from the tradition of Herzen, and then the nihilists of the 60s, and then people like, I don't know, Pisarev, Plikhanov, Chernyshevsky, and all the others. So this is the kind of continuation. And then suddenly, when they took power, they turned this Russia into the most really anti-Western incarnation of the Russian Empire. So Putin is probably the same, because he was kind of also continuation of the Yeltsinism. He was not a rupture from the Yeltsinism. He was a natural continuation of the Yeltsin, and then gradually he moved to this horrible thing. And this is really something that Russians should think about and understand where are those roots of this, because I also contrast the Ukrainian intellectual culture with Russian intellectual culture in this aspect, because in Ukraine, being a Westernizer or being a Slavophile, well, this discussion does not exist, first. And secondly, okay, you can see the discussion between traditionalists and modernists, and both of them, traditionalists and modernists, would be saying that Ukraine needs to be with Europe, right? And the Ukrainian version of Slavophilism was rather a version of Cyril and Methodius brotherhood that was rather closest to the Slovak and Czech ideas of the Slavic unity. So basically to the Western Slavs and to Eastern Slavs. And this is it. I mean, and that's a paradox. So in Ukrainian intellectual history, the consensus is that we are part of Europe. In Russian political history, intellectual history, the consensus is that we are not part of Europe. Or I would say that if it's even more complicated, Russians want to be an Asia for Europe. So they want Europe to understand them as Asia. And the problem is that they still continue to be kind of a Europe in this, but the kind of anti-Europe within Europe, and therefore all their senses are the reflections and distortions of these senses that they got from the West. Look at the way how they portray right now Ukraine. They're saying that Ukraine is totalitarian. Okay, they were saying that Ukraine is fascist and Nazi. We all know that, all this bullshit. But then they are saying now that Ukraine is totalitarian, and then this is a country of slaves. Well, this is what we are saying about Russians, but with certain sense, because Russians don't have a democracy, they don't have a pluralism of media. Ukraine all has all these elements of democracy, and still Russians are saying, no, we are the real democracy. So they are not really describing themselves in the kind of a terms, kind of alternative to the idea of democracy. They just change the very sense of the word democracy. They just use it in a very different way. So they want to be an Asia for Europe. And this is the paradox, because now they're increasingly turning into kind of into Europe for Asia, and that will be a very different task for them, because and very unpleasant task, because as you rightly said, well, Pushkin was inspired by the French poetry and not by the Chinese one, and Chaadayev and Tuchev were writing in French and not in Farsi. So of course their roots are in European culture, but they kind of always denied. My metaphor is that they take all the content from the Western cultures and then put it to the extremes. And to the extremes, like Dostoevsky is the writer of the extremes. He takes one emotion, one idea, and just leads it to extreme. And in this extremity, there is kind of at a certain level, there is no capacity to make a distinction, no capacity to make a difference, because you are thinking in the realm of so-called infinity. Russians always despise borders between countries, between cultures, and between concepts. If you read Russian literature, I quoted Merezhkovsky, for example, you can read lots of novels by Merezhkovsky, but still not have an idea what he's going to say. What does he want to say? Because he says one thing and then the opposite. He shows that he shows the ambiguity of everything. And I think showing ambiguity of everything is a good element of critical thinking, but it is not critical thinking per se. And Russians, by showing ambiguity of everything, I think they just lose at a certain moment an idea of morality, because if you can't, if you don't have a distinction between anything, you just confuse at a certain moment the good and the evil, and the saint and the demon, and this is what is happening right now. And then then you say that those people who fight against fascism are fascists, and those people who are victims of genocide are genociders. That's what they're saying right now.
Well, yeah, the two thoughts come to mind. One is it kind of that a common critique of postmodernism was that it is essentially committed to blurring boundaries and blurring definitions, and we see that in the way in which, for example, in literature, the idea of genres is now completely kind of thrown out the window. We have hybrid forms. All this is partly advanced and encouraged by technology. So on the one hand, you do have that sort of blurring of distinctions and boundaries as a very profound intellectual force in the West for quite a long time now. The positive side of it, of course, is, and it's something that we used to think about it very idealistically, even as late as the 90s, when the promise of technology was that it would eventually erase poverty and eliminate hunger, and things did not pan out that way. In fact, things went rather the opposite direction. But you thought that the idea of some kind of world culture, not so much that there would be one kind of intellectual or literary canon for the whole world, but rather there would be a common recognition, or a recognition of our common humanity, that would allow and encourage a kind of peaceful coexistence of these various cultures, required some sort of common foundation for values. And so you talk about the erasure of morality, and I was speaking about this with a writer friend the other day, and where do we find once more that kind of common text that offers a kind of moral code to which three people on any given block in this country could agree? What do you do when telling the truth ceases to be something a culture values?
Well, this is a very, very difficult question, of course, but I think we should, in a way, we should see how this idea of plurality and difference works for the better and for the best. I think the idea of humanity is to preserve as much creativity, as much plurality as possible. And this should be one of our kind of narratives and one of our regulatory idea. Of course, it is difficult for any single mind to accept this plurality, we understand this, especially in Ukraine, when you really have, when your conscious becomes very narrow. Actually, it's very hard to have this idea of plurality during the war. But still, I think this is the fight for plurality as well. Fight against the force that is unifying, that is erasing plurality, that is erasing differences, as I said initially. Maybe this can be foundation, one of our foundation. The next foundation, I think it's a kind of a new type of biophilia, and this is something that we gradually go in the 21st century, as we suddenly, well, not suddenly, gradually extend the very concept of morality to other beings, not only human beings, other living creatures. And I personally think that this is really great. Something great is going on, because we are revising our concept of nature. We are revising our concept of ethics. We as humanity increasingly think that dignity, for example, is not only the concept for human beings, it is also a concept for other living creatures, for animals, maybe for plants as well. Of course, we also should pose the question where it ends. Where does this level limit of life and living beings ends? But I think this is the great horizon for us, and this is something in which modernity and tradition can actually find a place together, because, well, tradition is primarily about living in line with nature, right? And modernity kind of splits with it, but I would say it's not already postmodernity, it's something different. It's kind of an eco-modernity, I would call it in this way, right? So it's an idea how we can use modern technologies to rebuild that feeling of harmony with nature that we have. And by the way, on this, I do have hope for Ukrainian culture as well, because Ukrainian culture has this very deep ecological tradition of thinking, right, and of imagining things. So Ukrainian culture is very botanic, where love plants, is very also animalistic. In a way, it has so many pre-Christian elements. I sometimes joke that between Catholic Poland and Orthodox Russia, we chose paganism, good in a good sense of the term, some kind of pre-Christian ideas,
Well, and the
and
pantheism that is part of that.
maybe pantheism, because I mean, if and the paradox is that our biggest pantheist literature comes from our modernists, from Lesya Ukrainka and from
Sure,
Kozybinsky, right?
sure.
So this is also an element where modernism and traditionalism coincide in Ukrainian culture, and I think this is also something in which Ukraine can give a certain ideas for the world, right? Because the world is now split. In America, this is a split between the progressivism and traditionalism, or I don't know how you call it.
That's good. Yeah.
In Britain, you have the same. In France, you have the same. In Poland, you have the same. And Ukrainians, in this way, they kind of are trying to seek another way and say, okay, there is a point where modernization and creativity and traditionalism actually coincide, and let's look for this point. And I think this eco thinking can be one of these ways.
That's very. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that one of the most exciting uh, uh, areas in which we are beginning to into which we're beginning to move and deepen our knowledge is precisely the recognition of, if you will, the language of the natural world. There's so much more sort of research being done and kind of really close scientific studies that are now documenting the way in which trees communicate with each other, right, through the fungi underground. I was reading in the Washington Post just the other day that they have now discovered that spiders themselves have REM sleep and dream. You know, that sort of that nature speaks, and you're quite right that I had just recently reread Les Ukrinka's Song of the Forest, and there you have an animate natural world that literally sort of is embodied and speaks to and with humans, and you've got that kind of greater sensitivity to the natural world that has not been lost in the best of Ukrainian literature, that has now been revived and has become a kind of an important intellectual force throughout the world. I don't know if you're familiar with a group in England called Writers Rebel. It's a group of writers who are kind of committed to working on behalf of the environment, who are staging protests against sort of coal plants and so on, and against fossil fuel development. So yeah, I completely agree that is a hugely positive development and the direction in which the world can choose to go in. And I similarly agree that the sort of that our ability to discover the way in which different cultural streams can support and enlarge each other is a possibility, and a truly valuable one. I always think that the greatest period in English literature was the Elizabethan period, when you suddenly began to have these continental influences coming into the literature. You had sonnets from Italy, you had French forms coming into the English poetry, and that kind of collaboration and cultural energy that infused, that entered English itself, led to Shakespeare and so on, that kind of enlargement of sensibility.
And who is our Shakespeare? Is precisely Lesya Ukrainka, because I think they're really comparable in terms of the power of the drama, and they're comparable in their horizon, because Shakespeare has the variety of topics, incredible variety of topics, from ancient British history to Roman history to Italy, whatever else, and so does Lesya Ukrainka, because when you take her dramas, then Lisova Pisnya and Boyarinya are probably the only ones centered in Ukraine. Everything rest
Right.
is centered
Cassandra,
in
right,
Roman Empire,
right.
in
Greek,
America,
right.
in Britain, whatever else.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. So that's on the plus side of the ledger, and it's good to have that in mind, because it's too easy to be sucked into the darkness that we're also sort of surrounded by and fighting against. And I do think it's so essential to keep reinforcing these other developments that are simultaneous, and parallel, and toward which we can lean and move. So this is a kind of a maybe a very simple question, but it's sort of important to me in different for different reasons. I mean, how do you distinguish between kind of culture and society? Because let me just kind of clarify what I mean is, that it's hard for it would be hard for I'd be hard pressed to define American culture, but I would say that I would certainly be tempted to start speaking about Whitman and Emily Dickinson, say, as avatars of two powerful tendencies in the American spirit. One that is very outward and extraordinarily embracing of experience and democratic and fleshly and bodily, and the other one which is more hermetic and inward and differently mystical, though both have their mystical streaks. But I wouldn't say that is what I would propose as the sort of those are two of the emblems of American culture that I'd like to have others recognize as essential components of the American soul. However, I would not say that American society, as I kind of look at it when I look at popular culture, necessarily reflects or embraces that culture. There seems to be a to what degree do you I think we sometimes treat them as synonyms.
Yeah,
And
right. Well, I think that culture is society's unconscious, and
hmm,
it is not present in it might be not present in some ordinary life, but it is present during some I think two episodes. The first is dreams, of course, and the second is some critical situations. This grand situation, the situations where there is a really question about to be or not to be, and this is it. When we talk about Ukraine, right? There were lots of sociological studies about the way which values are present in Ukraine, the values of freedom or the values of obedience, certain patriarchy. And it appears in sociological studies that lots of this patriarchal society, or society of those people who actually expect some assistance from the state or hate everybody else because they do not get what they want. But the real question is what erupts during these moments of crisis, and I think this is something that we see, the spirit of freedom and a spirit of self-organization. So
Mm.
what we might ask, okay, whether Ukrainian society is really self-organizing, and the answer is probably no in ordinary situations, because sometimes I see it in the neighbors of my house, multi-story building. It's very difficult to get them together and to organize some things together. But when those critical situations come, everybody works as a kind of self-organized organism.
Mm.
Maybe this is also the trait of any society. I don't know. That would be very interesting to understand. But here probably where culture and society might coincide, because the key thinkers, the key poets are just understand it and see it better, what society might be. So they really look at the society as a, how you say Husin in English?
As a I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you
The
Hussein.
butterfly. What what
Oh,
what what is the embryon of a butterfly?
yes, yeah. Oh, yeah. The cocoon, the
Yeah, the
cocoon.
cocoon. So
Yeah,
probably
the
the
chrysalis, the chrysalis, the
yeah, the
chrysalis. Yes,
chrysalis, right? The
yeah,
le chrysalide in French.
yeah.
So probably Taras Shevchenko just looks at this chrysalis and sees the butterfly, and
Hmm.
suddenly, during the
Sure.
moment of crisis, it is really a butterfly. So
Hmm.
this is probably the difference. And then when I'm saying that the key element of the Ukrainian political culture is the concept of hromada, which was developed by Drahomanov,
Hmm.
in the peaceful times, you're probably not noticing it very much, but on the 24th of February and 25th of February, it just appeared so well,
Hmm.
because you have the checkpoints everywhere. Every village has its little army to defend itself, and it was so remarkable when people started self-organizing without really any orders from above. So I would define it in this way. And the question is, of course, whether these aidos of a nation, uh, it expresses itself. Okay, it expresses itself in the critical situations, but whether it is able to express itself in normal situation. And I think that's something which is a problematic in Ukraine, because it can be so fantastic and so heroic right now, but what will happen? Imagine, of course, we all believe in our victory, but what will happen after this victory? There is a risk that society will turn back from the butterfly into this chrysalis, right, and go into inertia of something. There is a danger of
Of
this.
course, of course. Well, we're speaking practically on the eve of September 11th here, and what you're saying reminds me of that period of national unity and coming together in the face of that particular crisis and that tragedy. And there was that sense of kind of collective spirit and of resistance that had dire consequences later, and was severely a moment that was severely misunderstood in, at least from my point of view, and in its follow-up, and led to profound destruction, utterly unnecessary destruction in so many parts of the world. It's one of the things that I'm always sort of mindful that I live inside an empire that has done many evil things and has caused a great deal of damage, and so I never want to romanticize it. In fact, indeed,
Absolutely, but there is a difference of your empire and Russian empire, that you
I
you
agree. Sure.
you are you can talk about it, and there are lots of Americans who talk about it, and you
Yes.
change, you feel your responsibility. When I'm talking about collective responsibility, Americans have collective responsibility for the racism, for the slavery, for the annihilation of the indigenous people. But you
Absolutely.
change. I think you change.
Well, it's a struggle, but it's a struggle. You know,
It's a struggle.
it's a very kind of dynamic process right now, and many of us are concerned about how it's going to come out. And that is, I think, one of the reasons that you have this, and this kind of leads me to the next area I wanted to talk about, because, you know, it's this one of the reasons that I think that we in the United States are following what has happened in Ukraine and are so moved by it is precisely because we see it as a struggle on behalf of democracy and democratic values and pluralism. Those are the sort of elements that I think are very identifiable to some of us. But there is also another strain within the United States that is well, sometimes overtly, as our previous president, when Putin began his invasion, said, "Well, that was genius." You may recall, and there is a that side of the American kind of society that is siding with Orban and with authoritarianism itself, and it's definitely a tension inside this society and culture as well. I hope that we too prevail in our in our struggle, and we are watching, and we are with you, because your struggle and victory are essential for ours as well, I believe. The other thing but that leads me to wonder, what do you see as the kind of differences in perception and understanding of Ukraine between kind of Europe and the United States? I've had several conversations with friends who have suggested that there is uh, more sympathy for Russia in Europe than there is in the United States, which has kind of profoundly surprised me. Is that what you've seen?
I think that Europe is a hostage of its faith that security
Mm,
is already a commodity that you
mm,
buy in a supermarket, and you pay increasingly lesser price for it. And this is a problem, I think, for Europe. Europe believed too much in this eternal peace. Its very ideas built that we have built a continent of peace, and after the Second World War there was no major wars on the European continent. That is wrong. I tell Europeans all the time, you look on not where you should be looking at. You should be looking at the real origins of the European Union, and that is the Pan-Europa, the treaties by a fantastic Austrian, who is called Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi. His text in 1923, actually, or I think 1922 even, after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. And basically, the founding fathers of the European Union, Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, they really admired this person, and they was still in this line of people. Then there was this rewriting of the European history in a way that you now see in all these textbooks with nice blue and yellow, covers. Which, because if you look at what Coudenhove-Kalergi was saying, he was saying, look, there is a great danger of two imperial projects, the Germanic one and the Russian one. He was writing in 1922. In Germany, you have Weimar Republic, no trace of the older empire, everything chaotic, anarchic. He saw that Germanic empire will come back with Hitler, etc. 10 years before Hitler actually came. With the Russian Empire, yeah, it was Soviet Union, everything kind of also anarchic. The year of establishment, Soviet Union, Lenin with also ideas of self-determination of nations. But then he said, okay, guys, next partition of Poland is inevitable, or something like that, He understood that in order to make the imperial extension impossible, smaller nation states should unite and form what in the 19th century people called the Republic of Nations. And I think this concept, Republic of Nations, is one of the most important in the world right now, because we all should be also striving to this. And we failed with League of Nations, we failed with United Nations, but we should still work on this. And this is an old concept. And And he understood that the key idea of what he called United States of Europe is basically to protect itself against the big empires that will extend, right? And when European integration started developing after collapse of this imperial project, the Germanic one, it was still kind of developing in a sense that, okay, empires are kind of obsolete, they are misunderstandings, they will soon disappear somehow. Europe relies upon the security provided by United States and NATO. And this is the truth that Europeans do not want to accept. When I was in France, for example, with good friends and good people supporting Ukraine, but there was so much upset that asking, so why Ukrainians you choose United States rather than Europe? I say, how come? Why you pick this decision? Why you think like that? They were really jealous about it, and somehow I was saying, no, we are the same world. We are the same free world. There is no division, profound division between Europe and United States. But some people in France I saw when I was asking them, do you see that? Do you think that Trump and Putin are the same threat? I understand that for anti-Trumpists in the United States, for the democratic people in more general sense of the word, Trump is some kind of a nightmare, fascism, or whatever else. But America showed that it can cope with it, I think. And you cannot really compare Trump with Putin because Putinism is all Russia is Putinist.
Mhm.
Only half of America, maybe, or I think even less, is
Sure,
Trumpist.
less,
And
considerably less.
you still have this resistance, and this is very important. So I think that Europeans overestimate this guarantee of security. They really believed in this illusion that the war will not be possible, and that the European Union is by its economic integration safeguards against the war. This is
Mhm.
this is a mistake, of course. And therefore, I'm now telling the Europeans, look what Russians was saying last year, all this ultimatum they were bringing to the West. Did you read it literally? Because you need to read it literally. What they were saying is that European security should be based upon two pillars. One American, the other is Russian. What does this mean? This means they want to come back to 1945. This means that they want to divide Europe once again. This is real. This is what they said literally, without any metaphors. And then I say, okay, imagine Trump comes back to power in America, and then Russians come to Trump and say, okay, we will help you to fight China. We will make a war together against China. But for that, you give us half of Europe. That means, what does it mean? You just withdraw from NATO. And I'm asking Europeans, do you think this scenario is utopian? I would not say that anything is utopian right now. But imagine this: United States withdraw from NATO, and Ukraine is the last bastion against Russian army. Is there any other army in Europe which is able to confront the Russian army right now? Maybe Polish one, but certainly not German, not French, not any other else. So this is the sad reality, and I think Europeans are living, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are living in a kind of a still illusion.
Mm. Yeah, Jefferson spoke about the boisterous sea of liberty, and I'm reminded that democracy is not a gift but a prize, and something that you need, in fact, always to keep fighting for and to maintain. That desire for security, it reminds me of a poem by the Elizabethan poet Ben Jonson, who said that security, it is the common moth that eats at arts and wits and destroys them both. It lulls us into a kind of deep sleep, and we awaken in a nightmare. And that is so yeah, I um That's what you've said is quite sobering and a powerful sort of thought experiment too, to consider that sort of division. There are many more questions that we could probe in this area. I just want to touch on two other points here. One is that you on your website, and we've heard so much about disinformation and so on. Is there anything you want to sort of say about how to navigate this very increasingly complex landscape of news and information? It seems to me a universal problem, but one that's especially pointed right now in regard to Ukraine. I have spoken to friends who follow certain websites here in the United States, and they have a very different sense of the history and what is happening even here in the United States. And never mind friends who are in India and elsewhere, or in Greece, I had a friend who said that in Greece he had heard that it was that the United States had been threatening Russia with nuclear war, and that is why Russia had invaded. So there are all kinds of so much disinformation that I think both of us as teachers need to wrestle with this question about how to prepare students for learning how to differentiate between again, truth and lies, useful information and disinformation. Any sort of easy answers for that?
Well, easy no, but a few points, I think. First point, disinformation is not the biggest enemy, I think, in the information field. For me, the biggest enemy is dehumanization. And Russian propaganda was primarily about dehumanization. Russian propaganda is mostly built upon opinions, upon emotions, not upon even slightest work with facts or with reality. And if you follow the Russian TV, it was precisely about to prove that Ukrainians are Nazis, that Europe is collapsing, and that America is collapsing, and etc. And the idea to dehumanize the enemy was the key idea, actually, of this propaganda. So I think everywhere when you see this dehumanizing messaging is actually, and especially if they're coming from not from just users, from people, but they're coming from from some TV stations, especially state-owned TV stations. Well, of course, we should avoid it, and we should understand that there is something behind it. And therefore, for Ukrainians, it's a very difficult task right now, how not to be in this dehumanizing spirit. Of course, there is hatred of Russia and Russians, obvious, but I'm just thinking how to make this hatred into indifference, and how to avoid this very simplistic thinking. But of course, it's very difficult in the current circumstances. Obviously, when people lose their sons, their relatives, it is very difficult. So the first thing is to understand that the goal of propaganda is to dehumanize, and only then to disinform. The second thing is to have trust, renewed trust to journalists. So whether journalists are good or they are bad, they're good in the job, they're bad, they still have in their job description to kind of to aspire to build truth and to verify facts, and they can really suffer for not doing that. This is the difference between journalists and bloggers and politicians and all the rest. We do have to rehabilitate this profession. Doesn't mean that everybody is good in this profession, but I think everybody can more or less understand, okay, this is top 3, top 5 media to whom I will trust. And the third thing, well, I think the emotions are also very problematic. So we are acting online demands from us very quick emotions, very quick reactions. Emotions are the fastest things in our mind. There is a great book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. So it's better to be on the slow thinking side
Right.
many times, and rather than on the fast thinking side. And when you mentioned this their narrative in Greece, I think we should, of course, you can read what is going on as a kind of a fight between different imperialism, and you can say, okay, they're both bad. But I think we are dealing with Western imperialism, which is trying to be critical of itself, and I would say, how to say these words, kind of repentant. Can we say
Mhm.
repentant?
Yes,
Repentant
sure.
imperialism that accepts its fall. Maybe in some aspects it's not sincere, but at least the discourse is there. And the other Russian imperialism, which says that decolonization was bad, that it was a mistake,
Mhm.
that empires are the only nations that can actually have a right to exist, that politics is only about big power, and no de-imperialization will be in our history, in their history. So there is a discussion in America about the Iraq War. There is no discussion in Russia about Afghanistan war or
Mhm.
Ukraine so-called special military operation. I think that this is the difference. This is the key difference. Uh, in the Western society, you have a chance that a crime will be punished and that there will be justice. Russian society is built upon the idea of impunity. Impunity. Therefore, with my wife Tanya Harkova, I always quote her. In 2014, she just put very concise conceptualization of kind of a leitmotif of the Russian culture is crime without punishment and punishment without crime. And this
Mm.
is very
Brilliant.
important.
That's
So,
fabulous. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, that's a
this is what describes all these crimes. This is what describes gulags, when people were sent to death without any crimes, without any. This describes many things.
uh, that's. I hope that she has working on a monograph with that title, because that says so much. Um, yeah. Well, then, so just finally, and again, we could go on. There's those are all wonderful points. The question I get asked most often by friends when I talk about the war is also a wonderfully American question, and I say that in a very sort of positive spirit. That is, what can I do? I'm delighted to hear that question, but I'm just not sure about how best to direct people. Is there anything that you would want to suggest?
Well, I think the key thing is to support Ukraine and support the idea of Ukrainian victory, and understand that Ukrainians are really paying a big price, and there is a very important element. Not only, of course, it's important to support Ukraine, to maybe to donate funds, to organize humanitarian actions, etc., etc. But the key thing is to ensure that American support does not stop, because Ukrainians are paying with their lives, but in terms of weapons, we are still in a big disadvantage. And this is also the question of Russian impunity. There was a recently article by Ukrainian chief commander Valery Zaluzhny. I was surprised how psychoanalytical was the article written by our chief commander, because his conclusion was precisely that the key idea of the Russian war is to have the sense of impunity. They feel the sense of impunity. They can bomb Ukrainian cities without Ukrainians bombing Russian cities. And it doesn't mean that Ukrainians want to bomb Russian cities. We don't care about these Russian cities. We want them just to live in their cities and not take us. But we should end this story of impunity, which lasts from at least Stalinism or even earlier. So I think this is it. And when we're talking about the risks of the American politics, I think it's very important to support, to sustain this bi-party support of Ukraine, even if there are changes in government, that it does not affect the support for Ukraine. I think that this is the key thing.
Volodymyr Yermolenko, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation and great points. I look forward to continuing it another time.
Thank you, Askold. Great honor for me.